name is Janet Mbogwa, and we're filming this episode at the Fairview Hotel. Before we get into a panel discussion around toxic masculinity, manhood, and other definitions on this issue, here's a conversation with Amani Maranga.
Every man comes to a fork where he has to make some choices. Those choices could end up in being a shift, a complete paradigm shift in who you are as a man. And for me, that was last year. A few years before, my marriage had ended. I'd gotten into a dark space. I was in depression. And even through therapy, I hadn't gotten to the place that I needed to get. That was a fight for my life. But that happened last year. And I sought experiences that would get me to fight for me. I did 3 faith-based experiences. And the last one, Crucible, got me to a place where I faced myself. And for the first time, I met Amani. I met every part of who I was, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that was life-changing. Because you see, healing comes from acceptance, from first accepting everything that you are. And that's what happened to me. I accepted everything that I am. But then I had to ask a question. What kind of man do I want to be? And that was a fork on the road. On one hand, I was the same person I could have been. I was all along, with all the mistakes, all the nuances, all the history, and the things that worked and didn't work. On the other hand, was an intentional man, intentional to be safe, to be a safe man, safe to myself, but also to the people around me. And that's the journey that I started on, the journey that has gotten me to be in a place where I'm at peace with who I am, who I really am, but working to be better, working to be a good man, working to be a safe man, and hopefully one day working to be the right man.
Tell us about your podcast. What led you to start it?
Pain.
Pain.
Pain led me to start it.
Yeah.
So my podcast is called Living Truthfully. I was going through pain. And I was going through pain first based on decisions that I had made, choices that I had made that had led to the end of my marriage, but also the effects of that. My business ended at some point in that period. And so I lost everything that had defined me. And in my journey of self-discovery and self-awareness, when I was fighting for myself, I started to feel the need to express the things that I was going through, and I was learning.
Yeah.
And so I decided to out myself on a podcast because Kenyans don't listen to podcasts.
Now they're starting to. I'm sure at the time you were thinking.
70,000 downloads later, it might not be true.
Right.
Kenyans do listen to podcasts, and I'm happy with what the journey has become.
In fact, now that you've alluded to the fact that people are listening,
Yes.
What was the initial reaction? You know, there you are, you're being vulnerable, you're talking about your pain and experiences, something that maybe not a lot of men are seen to do, especially in Kenya. What was the reaction?
I had 2 distinctly different reactions. So here's the thing about vulnerability. Vulnerability threatens your reputation. Okay? So when you choose to be vulnerable, you risk your reputation, how you think people view you, which sometimes is based on how you view yourself, which might not be entirely correct. Your view of yourself might not be entirely correct. I thought my reputation would go down the drain. In fact, by the time I was making the decision, I had already said, screw reputation. This is what I have to do to heal. But here's a funny thing. By being vulnerable, people actually found a voice for them to be able to say what they were going through as well.
By people, do you mean men or women or both?
I think both.
Yeah.
And what I was risking grew. I got a new reputation. And I got a new reputation of authenticity. And that has been very affirming for me because I don't have to try and be somebody else. I can be myself, and that's accepted. But here's the second reaction that I got that was distinctly different. I met a section of women, and by met I mean by the feedback that I got, that were not ready to hear men be vulnerable. They're not ready to hear men speak their truth, their real truth.
What would they say? Or
It threatened their security.
like, you're not stable enough to take care of me?
I'm not ready to hear
Yeah.
that my father is broken. Because your father has been a rock. He's been solid. But he's hidden. He's protected you from seeing his pain and seeing, for most people.
And what do you think that does for men being able to express their emotions? Which, again, because today's topic is a little bit about men, masculinity. So, A, what does it do to men who are trying to express their emotions? And how does that how does that accelerate this toxicity that some people say now exists because in some ways men are not processing their emotions?
So there's a difference between processing. So there's feeling your emotions, then there's processing your emotions, then there's expressing your emotions. Let me first just cut men some slack. We have not seen, we've not been modeled for, especially from the men in our lives, emotions being expressed. And so we don't know how to, generally. Some might, and those that do, I'm so grateful for you. But we don't. I'm learning that today, for me, part of my integrity, my definition of integrity, is it's not just doing what I said I would do, but integrity for me is feeling what I'm feeling. It's being true to what I'm feeling. Then allowing myself to understand those feelings without judging them. But then lastly, finding a safe space to express those emotions. And I have to say that how we express emotion doesn't have to be how women do it. Because I feel like sometimes, the measure, the standard of how we express emotions is by, talking. And if I don't talk, then I'm not expressing that emotion. But guess what? If I go to the gym and I just punch a punching bag, I have expressed an emotion. And that, I felt the emotion, I processed it, and I expressed it through that punching bag.
Where then is the place for men to recognize, to have introspection? Do you feel like there is a link between men not expressing themselves and not being open about how they're feeling and some of the explosive stories that we've been seeing in the news lately? Issues of femicide, issues of, even if it's online bullying where there's a lot of violent words used against women. Is there a link, and how do we address it?
There's a link, but I think the link is a little further back than where, you've placed it. Because you've placed it at expressing emotions. I think it's further back. We are wired in a certain way that we don't see emotions the same way you do. Sometimes we don't even recognize them. And there's more awareness that needs to happen for me as a guy, for me to first recognize the emotions that I'm feeling, name them, and then figure out what to do with them. All right? And so I think, to be honest, there's a lot of men out there who have no idea first what they're feeling, even currently. There's a spectrum of emotions that they're feeling. There are things they're sad about, they're angry about, they're scared about, they're happy about, they're excited about, and maybe even places they feel compassionate to. But for them to be able to isolate those emotions, it's for a guy, that's like hard work. I do think, however, the larger part comes from a breakdown of our values system. Yes.
That's interesting, because I was going to say, in terms of a lot of men not being aware, I was almost going to say, is that an excuse or an explanation? Because there's every access to be aware. Isn't it about how then you say...
Let me give you a good example. I have a house help who comes from a less privileged background, okay? And sometimes she'll use the wrong towel for the wrong thing. Now, she has every access to gain awareness. But when she does it, is that the fact that she comes from a less exposed background, is that an excuse or is it an explanation?
Okay. We'll leave it at that because I know we're going to have a conversation a little, later on. But, truly appreciate that you have a podcast that allows men to be open and vulnerable. About excuses and explanations, that's coming up in a bit. Thank you, Amani. Stay with us. We'll be right back after this for the panel conversation. Toxic masculinity is a term that's being discussed a lot lately. The term is used to describe aggression and sexism that many say men use to exercise power and dominate the people around them. Some people are against this term, saying that it's being used to attack manhood, while others say that tackling traditional masculine ideologies is essential if we're going to achieve gender equality. Today we'll be talking to a group of 4 men who will be sharing their thoughts on masculinity.
Toxic masculinity does not exist as a term. Men and women do bad things. When men do bad things, we label it. But when women do bad things, just any other crime.
As a concept, masculinity is not toxic, but we need to broaden the conversation on masculinity to have healthy forms of masculinity.
I think it's deviating from the underlying issues and not finding out why we are arrived at that concept.
I believe, yes, there is an issue. We've got to dig deeper to find out that there's mental health issues, whether we've got negative retrogressive cultural practices, or whether we have other underlying issues that we've never found out.
Is there a thing called male privilege? There is, but the gender cannot be toxic. People can be toxic.
My prayer is that we move beyond opinion to facts and to science to find out why we are having the issues we are having at this moment.
And we need to use our masculinity in healthy ways.
I don't think there's a bad gender. I think there's just bad people.
What are your thoughts on the term toxic masculinity? I want to hear from each of you, so we'll start with you.
Toxic masculinity. Those two should not be in the same sentence.
Yeah.
At least not as a word. Masculinity is masculinity. It doesn't need a pre-qualification. We don't do that with femininity. So I think the term, the label, is, I don't agree with it. I do think, however, there are bad men who do bad things, there are bad women who do bad things.
Okay. Do you agree?
I absolutely agree with him. There's no way we can bad behaviors and then call an entire gender as toxic masculinity, while there are people who do bad things, they're in jail and they've stolen. I just think they're bad people and they're both in both genders, but we cannot claim and brand an entire noble thing as masculinity as toxic.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll come back
we have
with
toxic cars, we just have maybe
Bad cars.
bad cars.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a few reasons why it's there, but I'll come back and raise that and hear your views. What do you think about the term toxic masculinity?
I think this is a concept that has been developed and furthered by the feminist perspective, just to try and justify the reason why men behave in certain ways. So to me, it does not exist.
Okay.
It is not there.
My thoughts are that I used to be have a very rigid view of toxic masculinity, but then since I run a men's platform, as in gathering different views, it's kind of not diluted, but I kind of see like the point where using it as a blanket for different people who do different things might diverse from the conversation, but not to say that there are no aspects of what we might consider masculinity that can be used or can be used to excuse bad behavior. So that's where like the word toxic masculinity would, in that context.
I don't like what you're saying. I don't like what you're saying because the aspects are the people and not the masculinity.
Okay, but I'm not saying that masculinity is toxic. Because when people hear toxic masculinity, that's what they hear. They hear that we're saying that masculinity is toxic. And that's where we would say that using the term is a problem. But we should not say, since we don't agree, since we agree that toxic masculinity is a problem, we shouldn't say that there are certain aspects of what has been driven to me to say that I am a man. Like things like, like the things, for example, when you're a kid, you were told, umechapwa na msichana, as to mean being a man. No.
Like you've been emasculated.
Yes.
I think I can generally see an issue with this term toxic. But there's statistics, and I'll read some of them, and it says globally, suicide is the second leading cause of death in young people aged 15 to 29. 83% of the suicides in Kenya are by men. And then, of course, you have issues around incarceration of men, etc. So there seems to be a problem. And where is it coming from in terms of when we see these stats rise, when we see the rising cases of femicide, when we see the rising cases of whether it's even cyberbullying, if we can go into the online bubble, really meted against women, do you not then think that there's a problem around how maybe men are expressing themselves, how this masculinity conversation is being addressed?
But let me just say that there's something called the paradox of suicide, that women try 3 times more, but men are more successful than women.
Yeah.
Simply because of one, access to power. Like in the US, the leading cause of suicide is firearms. Most men have more firearms because they have more money and they have more power, and therefore when they try to kill themselves, they're successful. It doesn't mean that...
Successful not being the best term,
not being the best term.
But they end up dying.
They end up dying.
Yeah.
It's usually just the method that men use. In terms of incarceration, it's all about power dynamics. I have issues with us throwing statistics because statistics mean a lot. Unless we can isolate all the variables and say, you know what, by the way, we have isolated all the variables. These are not criminals. They're not traumatized. Maybe they're not found in a compromising situation. And we've removed all the variables to only land on toxic masculinity as the reason why certain men do the things they do. I believe we cannot lump it on toxic masculinity.
I'm with you on
That's
this one.
lazy statistics, if you call my opinion.
I'm with you on this one. Because the statistic you said is true. More women attempt suicide than men. So if we go to intention, and intention changes the crime. When it's a criminal offense, you look at both intention and the action. So it's called actus reus and mens rea. The women intend more to commit suicide. So
actually, they're more depressed. Actually, they're more diagnosed with depression than men.
But then, even when it comes to the statistics of men incarceration, I was thinking about crimes. And I thought about a simple abuse. Let's talk about verbal abuse. When a woman shouts at you, she's expressing herself. When a man shouts at you, it's abuse. So,
although not everyone would agree with that.
Okay.
Not everyone would agree with that.
But for most men, it would be seen as he was verbally abusing.
And he wasn't expressing himself.
And he was not expressing himself. And so there is a chance that at some point, the way we look at crime, it's not, the measuring stick is not the same.
Okay, and you've mentioned something about expressing themselves. At some point, I want to come and talk about how men express emotions, but you wanted to react to what Amani and Danish
I think to understand this concept, we must go back to the social orientation from the beginning and how girl child was socialized and how boy child was socialized. And you find out in that way that a girl was socialized and was given responsibility and they were given that avenue of expressing themselves. Girls really want to be identified by their mothers and boys want to be identified with their fathers. But when you study the society as it is right now, you find that we have an absent father. So the boy does not have that avenue of expressing whatever he has because there are some things he cannot tell the mother. He needed the father. So there's nobody to take him through the traffic of masculinity. And when there's nobody to take you through the traffic of masculinity, you can't speak out. And some of these things, if we can't express our emotions, then they come up like aggression and in crimes and suicide. And that's why you find out that more boys are on streets, in jails, or mentally ill.
Janet, I think I slightly disagree with him. Let's just go the medieval times. Most men went to hunt. Who was home? They were the mothers. So most men up to the age of 13 spend more time with their mothers than anybody else. I was raised by my mother. She was around me. It did not mean that now my father was walking away and therefore I need to have certain elements of aggression or toxic masculinity. Women play a critical role in the lives of men. We should never say that because a man is not existing in a man's life, a man does not know how to be a man. Mm-hmm. We are taught to be human beings. The reason why I have an issue with that is because, like I said, we need to be a bit more scientific so that we are not just generalizing, because when we generalize and we don't diagnose the problem correctly, we're likely to spend so much time doing the wrong thing and we may cause more damage. Mm-hmm. As it is right now, we are guilt-tripping single mothers who maybe have sons that you can't raise a man. There's no men in your life. How many, I mean, if you look at World War II, how many men died in that war? Who raised those men? And have they turned out fine? Mm-hmm. If you went to hunter and gatherer society, when men went to hunt and the women stayed behind, those men, did they turn out bad? Let's stop guilt-tripping men.
So then where do you think the problem is? And we'll very briefly say this, because let's look at, and you might say, we're just looking at it in one dimension, but let's, for example, take a lot of the headlines that we're seeing, whether it's, I think in the last few months, about 20 plus women have been murdered, the ones that have come to the news, right? Femicide. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it has been cases of, love gone wrong, etc. So do you not then think that there could be a problem in terms of modern day manhood and how it's being perceived, in the sense that traditionally, or back then, men were the ones who were more outspoken? For example, there wasn't a lot of women, or it was seen as, please sit down and hush, as opposed to now where there's a lot more women allowed to express themselves. Do you think that there's retaliations against traditional manhood that's affecting modern day manhood?
If I may quip into that conversation, I'd like to say, you brought up the statistic about men and mental health. But then mental health is influenced by very many factors. Just not being a man is not enough for me to have mental health issues. There's trauma from social trauma, I can get trauma from so many other avenues. But then on the conversation of mental health, for someone to heal, you need to have a bit of introspection, like you need to see inside and realize this and this and this have made me be in a certain way. And so, like, for example, in my journey, I wouldn't say toxic masculinity, but then I do realize that there's certain things that have been taught to me about being a man that hinder me from healing from that trauma that affects my mental health.
Okay, we have to take a short break. I want to come back because you're already going into expressing oneself, about healing, about introspection, and I'm glad you used that term because there's a question that I wanted to pose later on. So we'll be right back after this break. Lately, news reports have revealed the alarming rate at which women are being assaulted and even murdered. And in many circumstances, these are crimes of passion. Femicide has become a topic of heated conversation, many times linked to the so-called toxic masculinity. Here's how our panelists weighed in. You were saying something, Amani, which I was vehemently disagreeing with. But yes, please continue.
So I said I was asked to speak about femicide on my podcast. And I couldn't find an objective way.
How is there no objective way to talk about femicide? It's femicide.
It's not. What's femicide?
Femicide is the murder of women, specifically targeted towards women.
Okay, what is the murder of men called?
It's the same way. It becomes an isolated issue because of the nature of, you can see that there's a certain pattern.
Okay.
And it's
so let's talk
different in
about
the sense
patterns.
that,
I like
right.
it.
Okay.
So a few years ago, maybe 2-3 years ago, a lot of men were beaten and their genitals mutilated by women in Nyeri. There was a pattern.
Right.
What is it called?
Well, but that became a topical issue, didn't it become?
It
is abuse.
Was they given a name?
No, is it manicide?
No,
Like
it's
what?
not.
Yeah,
exactly.
But the reason why femicide stands out as a term is because it's a very specific, it's women, it's a lot of the time tied to love gone wrong, love gone sour, where a woman who is choosing not to be with a certain person ends up having her life taken from her. Because why didn't you want to stay with me? How could you reject me? It stems from the rejection of men, and the only way that these particular murderers, I'm not saying all men, but in these cases, is because it stems from rejection. And so that also brings out another issue about how we... Yes, you wanted to say something.
Femicide, we must establish motive that I kill you because men killing women because they hate women. How can we establish motive that this person hate this gender and that's why they kill? That's what is femicide, in my opinion. Femicide we must establish the motive. I think if you ask me, yes, there are men. Like last year, 87,000 women died. Half of them died because of relationship issues. It's horrible. It's horrible. But let us call those men murderers. Let us call them murderers. Let us call them beasts. Because the moment
I feel like
say,
if we do that,
yeah,
we then take away from the root cause of why these men decided to murder the women that they could not have. Don't you? Do you not feel like there's something underlying there?
I'm with you on that. I just
We
feel
are
like
not excusing, yeah.
The scale is not balanced.
The scale is not balanced.
It's not balanced.
Do you feel then that there's a certain way that men are being described and pushed to a corner because, and that women are not, like it's not in equal measure?
Yeah, I think first of all we must try to understand why are we having this conversation in 2019. Why are we having this conversation? And it's because of the trend. I'm not against a female being empowered. In fact, a society that wants to develop must really put a lot of effort in empowering women, which is fine. But when you empower women and you forget about the boy child, then you are creating a problem. And let me give you an example. If a 14-year girl gets pregnant, God forbid, and you will find that, and you will find out that the mother of the girl will embrace this girl, and then she will be taught how to become a mother, and she will go back to school. How about the boy that was responsible for this pregnancy? Is there anybody that will take him and teach him the responsibility of being a father? Let's say the boy was 16 or
so you don't feel like there's anybody looking out as much?
That conversation is missing, and it's like women are our mothers, but I feel like they're putting much focus on the girl child and forgetting that we are also their children. And the reason why the society is dysfunctioning is because we have isolated the boy child and the boy, and you cannot become a man if you are a boy. You cannot become a man if you never saw one in your life.
Which takes me back to the first question, or the question I asked, which is there a problem with modern day manhood? Do we feel like there's an issue with the way some men are internalizing it and how they're trying to shift, like, okay, in my father's time, things were pretty obvious. Now in my time, I have women who are my age mates, or they're even my bosses. They own more, they do more, they're more economically empowered, socially empowered. Do you think some of these shifts are creating an issue around how men perceive women?
I think the shifts, change is, and society is changing.
Yeah.
every day.
And everyone is adjusting to change. Mm-hmm. Everyone is adjusting to change. I don't think the problem is manhood. Mm-hmm. Okay? I don't think manhood is having a problem adjusting to change. Mm-hmm. Everyone is adjusting to change, and change is difficult generally, and we all are figuring out our new expressions of ourselves in this dispensation. But I do want to state clearly the answer to your question from my perspective is no. There's no problem with modern day manhood. Mm-hmm.
Where do you think the problem lies?
There can't be a problem with manhood. I mean, it's in its definition.
In the way men are perceiving, some men. Let me put caveats, because I've grown up around incredible men, incredible, starting with my father, my brothers, and that's just speaking as Janet's personal perspective, right? And some women have a totally different, really worse off thing, because the way they grew up around a lot of toxicity. But my question is, and I hear you, Amani, and I respect what you're saying, but are we saying that things are okay, business is going on as usual, or are we ignoring the fact that there does seem to be a shift that's creating a ripple effect where some men, like he said, are feeling cornered, are feeling lost, are feeling like she's got a voice and I don't have one anymore. I don't know where my voice fits in.
Feeling lost, yes, because feeling lost is a common thing that happens when change happens. You have to figure out how do I adjust in this new role?
So how can we adjust?
Okay, and that's a really good question.
That's what you were
Let me just respond to
Okay,
that.
let him respond and then
One,
you pick up your point.
On the femicide issue, let us not, I feel like we've got to condemn murder for what it is. When a man kills a woman, whether the wife or a girlfriend or whatever, we've got to condemn it and call it for what it is, both men and both women. I just feel like the moment we term it femicide, we are excluding men who may be allies and saying, okay, I'm a man, I don't hate women. But I know there are men who are murderers and they've murdered my sister. My sister has been a victim of gender-based violence. And I've felt like arresting and jailing that man many times. But now when it comes and then now I feel like now women are the ones for now saying it is our war. And they're isolating a whole group of other men who could be allies, but because of wording, because word has power. One word can isolate an entire population, and that fight now will be left to women alone, which I don't think is the right thing to do. Get more allies, in my opinion.
I'm a father of both genders. And that makes me think through what narrative I must give. I want security for my daughter, and I understand that everywhere she goes, that most likely, if there's going to be insecurity, it'll be perpetrated by a man. I understand that. But when I go out to the club to drink, I have a perennial fear that my drink will be spiked. Most likely by a woman.
All the time when you go out to drink, that's
And
what you think about.
it is my perennial fear when I go out to drink. Mchele. Okay? So what does that tell you? I don't think it's a gender problem. I think it's a values problem. It's a culture and values problem. Both men and women do bad things. And they do bad things to each other. And the value system of our society is broken. And it needs to be relooked. But I wouldn't demonize a gender for things that bad men or bad women do. I do have a challenge, though, for my brothers. I think we have a responsibility to protect our society. And I think we have a responsibility to protect the women in our lives, the women around us, and to be that father figure for where Maurice is saying, where there's no men to speak into the lives of boys and girls. And so I want to challenge the men who are listening to stand up and be counted, and to be men that can be pillars of their spheres of influence.
Thank you.
But 87,000 murders and one mchele?
It's not one mchele.
Okay, that's why this
We don't
conversation
have
will
the
continue
statistics.
online.
We don't have the statistics.
We're going to continue this
How
conversation
many men
online.
have died from mchele? But we know 87,000 women were butchered,
All right.
murdered, killed, dragged.
All right, Danish, Amani, pause.
Yet
One
there's a
second.
beauty queen.
Hang on. It's a very heated conversation, and I get why there's a lot of sensitivities around it. So on the Here and Now YouTube page, you'll find the continuation of this conversation. And to thank you all for being very open about your thoughts, feelings, and experiences. So please make sure that you continue watching the conversation online.